Hi, Lindenwood class. It's time to read some more Echo Mountain by Lauren Wolk. We're going to pick up with chapter 13. That night, when we gathered around my father to wish him good night, I laid my hand on his forehead and closed my eyes and told him without a word that I was going to bring him back. I concentrated so hard on that thought that I could feel it pulsing in my ears, and my hand grew hot on his cool skin, as if the flame in my chest had spread. I was startled when Esther pulled my arm away and said, "What are you doing, Ellie? Daddy doesn't need your sweaty hand on his face." "Do you have a fever?" my mother asked, pressing her lips against my forehead, and I closed my eyes and let myself feel that almost kiss, until she pulled back and said, "You'd better get on to bed. Your father is already sick enough." Later, as I tried to sleep, I touched that spot on my forehead again and again, but it was no softer than the rest of me. I hoped it would send me quickly to sleep, perhaps even to dream of my father waking and rising and growing brawny and brown again. But instead I lay in the darkness, as I always did now, jangled and jarred by a memory that kept me wakeful and sad long into the night. While my mother, my sister, my brother, my father all slept, I lay wakeful and remembered that January day. Esther gathering kindling under the trees at the edge of the yard where the snow was thinnest, watching Samuel while my mother was inside making stew. I remembered helping my father clear trees at the edge of the garden so in the spring we could plant more beans and peas and squash. I remembered him showing me where to stand as he swung his axe, how to keep a safe distance in case the tree kicked back like an angry horse and as it fell, how to make the cut so that the tree fell mostly where he wanted it to fall. In this case, downhill. In this case, away from him, away from me, where it could do no harm. But my mother was busy with the stew, and Esther was busy with her chores, and my father was busy with his axe. And I was the one who suddenly saw Samuel running across the open ground where the snow had drifted away, and the bare dirt was burned pale with cold. I was the one who saw that he was running after a rabbit, his eyes fixed on the white smudge of its tail. The tree broke just then, began its fall, began its great arc toward Samuel, its branches thrashing, slowing as it snagged on the branches of other trees, spinning heavily, and I charged beneath it, grabbing Samuel as I ran, both of us shoved from behind to land hard, just out of harm's way. I remembered lying on the cold ground with Samuel in my arms, how he struggled to get free, yelling, "Why'd you do that, Ellie?" I remembered holding him tight as I turned to see my father lying still under the tree's branches, his blood on the snow. I remembered not knowing what to think about that. I remembered pulling Samuel away before he could see my father, dragging him toward the cabin as he tried to break loose from my hand clenched tight around his wrist, hauling him farther from the garden and the tree and my father, casting him into the snow where Esther was gathering wood, where Esther was supposed to be watching him, where Esther was unaware of any trouble, until I raced into the cabin yelling for my mother, until I ran back to where my father lay, my mother with me, Esther chasing us, calling, "What happened?" and Samuel chasing her, all of us climbing through the chaos of branches and dirt and snow to try to lug the tree off my father, all of us pulling at it together as he lay so still beneath it that I was sure he was dead. We couldn't reach him through the tree's sharp tangled limbs, no matter how Esther yelled his name, no matter how hard my mother worked to break the smaller branches, her hands torn up from trying. But we all, together, finally managed to pull some of it off him, and then I bent away the thinnest branches until they bowed, taut and difficult, in my arms, while my mother and Esther tugged him away inches at a time, Samuel crying "Daddy" again and again, but too small for anything else. My mother reaching through the branches, feeling my father's neck, feeling for his pulse, finding it, and then with a mighty surge, pulling him from the last of the tangle and onto open ground, to turn him over and call his name, holding his face in her hands, the blood matting his hair, his skin a shocking white, all of us calling him, my sister holding one of his hands in both of hers, Samuel tugging on the hem of his pant leg, my mother kneeling alongside him, then scrambling to her feet, looking wildly around, her hands dripping with blood, and then running for an old blanket that we made into a hammock to drag him, his poor body bumping along the frozen ground, and then slowly, horribly, up onto the cabin's step, and through its door, and across the floor, into the washroom, laying him near the drain and pouring warm water over his wound to clean it, waiting for him to wake up. I will never forget the moment when we all stopped and sat back, exhausted, and looked at each other, at him, at the pink water trailing from his head, all of us breathing hard. Samuel still crying, crawling into my mother's lap, his face red and snotty and swollen. "Run to the Petersons, Ellie," my mother said, her voice shaking. "Tell them to fetch the doctor. Tell them to hurry." Chapter 14. It was only days later, after the doctor had come and gone, after we had had time to consider the idea of my strong, laughing father never waking again, that my mother asked how he had come to be in the path of the tree as it fell. She looked at me, who had been with him. Esther looked at me, who had been with him. Samuel said, "Did you see what happened, Ellie?" He turned to my mother. "Ellie knocked me down." And I simply could not say, "I knocked you down to save your life." I simply could not say, "And the tree knocked Daddy down because of you." I loved him too much to do that to him, and I knew my father would wake up. I knew he would, and tell everyone the truth of it. By then it wouldn't matter that Samuel had chased a rabbit into harm's way. My father would be well again, my mother would smile again, and everything would be all right again. I knew it would. So I said, "No, Samuel, I didn't see what happened. One minute Daddy was cutting the tree and I was dragging some branches into a pile, and then the tree fell. I didn't mean to knock you down, Samuel. I was running to get help, and I didn't mean to knock you down." He frowned at me for a long moment, and I hoped that he wouldn't work too hard to unravel that thread, to sort out the jumble of what had happened. "You were in the way, weren't you?" my sister said. At first I thought she was talking to Samuel, but then I realized she was talking to me. Talking to me. Esther wasn't a mean girl, but she never tried to be more gentle than she was, and it was clear that she needed a reason, an explanation, someone to blame. My mother looked at me too, waiting for an answer. She wasn't angry like Esther was, but it was clear that she had no extra space in her heart just then for anything except my father. Part of me wanted to tell them that it was Samuel's fault, if a little boy could be blamed for such a thing. But when I thought of saying words, I felt sick and sad. When I thought of Samuel someday learning that he had drawn his father into this disaster, perhaps even into death, I felt even more terrible. And I knew how Esther would feel, she who should have been watching Samuel. Which was when I decided that it would be worse to pass the blame than to shoulder it. If I'd learned anything from the mountain and from my father, it was that I felt stronger and happier if I was able to do a hard thing and do it well. So I kept silent, and they took my silence as a confession. It was difficult to tell as I lay in the darkness, remembering, my face wet with cold tears, whether I had slept and woken or never slept at all. Esther was quiet but for the slow tempo of her breath. Samuel sighed and murmured in his dreams. I slipped from my bed and out of the cabin, closing the door behind me without a sound. The trees wore gowns of starlight. The dew was cold and luscious on my bare feet. From somewhere up mountain an owl sounded lonely, forlorn, beautiful. It seemed a terrible shame to sleep through such a night, and I was glad to be up before the sun. I whispered Maisie's name as I opened the door to the woodshed. She lifted her head and slapped her tail against the ground as I crept inside and found the jar I'd borrowed for gathering stink. I unscrewed the top and scraped the lid of the jar against my cheeks until I'd captured what tears remained on my face. Almost nothing. I carried the jar back outside and dragged its mouth through the grass, gathering dew. Then I retrieved the balsam I'd hidden behind the woodshed and scraped it into the jar too. Perhaps tomorrow I would climb down to the river that had carved a valley through the mountains. Its cold, clear water had never failed to make my father smile. And after that, maybe I'd harvest honey from the hive down beyond the brook, ready with a pouch of mud for the stings I was sure to get along the way. But for now, I contented myself with the stars pulsing overhead, the trees reaching eagerly up, the feel of April on my skin. When I stirred them, the embers from the tallow fire glowed hungrily, so I fed them bits of dry wood and leaves and pine cones until I had a good fire going. "Ellie," my mother whispered from the cabin door, a blanket around her shoulders, "have you lost your mind?" "I couldn't sleep," I said softly. "I was visiting Maisie." "And the fire?" I shrugged. It was lonely too. Which made her smile. So unexpected to see her standing on the step in the darkness, veiled in starlight, the white of her smile a quick surprise, then gone as she turned to go back inside. And I stood there for a while, the fire popping and hissing, and thought about that smile. And then I thought about it some more. When the fire wore itself out, I took my jar of tears and dew and balsam into the woodshed and put it high on the shelf with my other secrets. "I'm making some medicine," I whispered to Maisie as I lay down next to her, the puppies in a muddle of dark softness against her belly. "Maybe I should add some of your milk." But she didn't answer me, and I fell asleep and dreamed about nothing at all until morning woke me again. Chapter 15. The morning began as any morning might, a matter of yawns, squinting at the weather, wobbling on the tightrope between yesterday and tomorrow, but the day to come would be one of the longest and most interesting of my life. After a proper breakfast with no punishment in it, I went out to finish my morning chores. To these I added new ones. Took Maisie her breakfast and sang her a small song I made up on the spot, full of barn cats and field mice and goldenrod bowed down with yellow. Coaxed her outside for some air, but stayed in the shed with the puppies so she wouldn't fret. Laid my hand over Quiet like a warm cape and told him things like, "You are beautiful. You are a beautiful, silly little dollop of a dog." When Maisie returned, I decided to go for honey and river water, but my father had taught me never to pass up the chance to get what food I could. You never know when there won't be any to be had. So I gathered his fishing gear and put it with the medicine jar and some oilcloth for wrapping my catch, a pair of work gloves, and some tinder in my pack, the pack on my shoulder, and set out for the river. Samuel followed me, and I let him, sure that he would tire before long and head back home. "Where you going, Ellie?" he said as I went down the path toward the river. "To see if I can catch a fish for supper," I said, though that was only one of the things I meant to do. "With so much venison to eat?" "Mother will make most of that into jerky, for when there isn't any fresh. Besides, I like fish." "I don't much," he said, though Mother always fried it crisp and gave it to us with pickles and cream. "Well, I don't much like jerky, and I don't like being hungry. But if you'd rather eat pickles and cream without fish, that's fine with me." At which he said, "Huh," and nothing else. The path was steep and rocky in places, but there were saplings all along it, and the ones nearest the difficult spots were smooth from where we had grabbed them again and again to steady ourselves. I had long since learned to find a handhold before I took a hard step down, but Samuel preferred to hop from rock to rock, and it wasn't long before he fell. "Oh, good grief," I said, as he lay crying on the path, banged up, but with no real damage done. "How many times do you have to fall before you realize you're not a mountain goat?" He looked up at me with a wet face. "I don't think I'm a goat. Why would I think I'm a goat?" "Never mind," I said, helping him up. "Just slow down. I have a fish to catch, and you're here to help or go home." He brushed himself off. "Help, then. I'll go home when I want to go home, and not because you said so," which I ignored completely. And we set off again, the river still far below us, Samuel scooting ahead as soon as the path leveled out a bit, determined to lead the way. I let him, since it was easier to keep an eye on him if he was ahead of me, but I wished he would stay near. That was always one of my wishes, to keep him near. There were many things that tempted me as we went down the mountain. A fresh green meadow where fire from lightning strike had cleared a few acres of trees before rain had put it out. A vernal pool where peepers sang so loudly at twilight that we could hear them even far up mountain. A granite ledge big enough for me to sit on, like a turtle in the sun. But I decided to keep those things for another day. And I left the honey, too, for the trip home, since it would be harder to fish with bee-stung hands. But I heard the hive hidden in an oak as we passed, and the old tree, too, humming with excitement as its buds erupted into leaf. As we passed by there, I saw a brand-new gift, sitting on a white rock at the edge of the trail where even Samuel might have seen it if he hadn't been in such a hurry. A honeybee. made of wood and something I couldn't name. I held it up in the light, smiled, peered into the trees, said, "Thank you," in case someone was listening. "I wish you'd come out and meet me." "And I wish you'd hurry up," Samuel said from down the path a bit, "or the river's going to dry up before we get there." I put the bee in my pocket and held it there in my hand, looked long into the trees all around me, saw nothing, waited until Samuel disappeared around a bend, and then, feeling a little foolish, said, "I don't know why you won't show yourself." The trees stood quietly, waiting as I waited, but nothing moved, nothing answered, and I did not dare let Samuel reach the river before me. But when I hurried down the trail, I found him standing quiet and still, with his hand up to stop me. He whispered, "Look there, Ellie." I saw, over his head, not on the trail, but in the trees to one side, the ghost dog, a rabbit hanging limp from his mouth. He stared back at us. Samuel must have seen something in that dark eye, because when I came up alongside him, he slowly worked his way behind me, put one hand flat on my back, peered out from around me, and said, "I don't like him." I felt sorry for the poor rabbit in those straws, but I'd been known to eat a rabbit too. "He won't hurt us," I whispered. "How do you know?" "Because I've met him twice before, and he didn't hurt me. Remember when I came up to the Petersons and said I'd seen a dog?" I said nothing about the hag, or whether this might be her mutt. I imagined Samuel climbing up to her camp, ending up in a pie, and I understood why my parents hadn't talked about her. "He's just a hungry stray." "Then let's catch him and take him home for ours." But I had no intention of doing that. Maisie and Quiet, and for a while, the other puppies were ours if they were anyone's, but this dog was not. If he was the hag's, something had changed up there at that camp. Something had sent him down among us. I wondered what, and I decided, just then, to find out. "Git!" I suddenly yelled, waving an arm, and the dog loped off through the brush and out of sight, the rabbit flopping in his mouth. And I thought it odd that the dog had not eaten it right away, as most hungry dogs would, while it was still warm. "What'd you do that for?" Samuel said, coming out from my shadow to glare at me. "He could have been my dog, Ellie." "Or you could have been his boy, more likely. He's too much dog for you, and wild besides. Otherwise, you wouldn't have hidden behind me." At which Samuel glared harder. "I wasn't hiding. You make me sound like a baby. I'm not a baby, Ellie." "Of course you're not," I replied. "You haven't been a baby for years and years." "And years," he said. "Third time you've been right." And we'll stop there for today. See you in class on Tuesday.